Okay, welcome back to the fifth and final video of my series covering the basic rules of Fading Glory. Today we're going to wrap up by talking about night turns and reinforcements, as well as lulls, and a bit about the event cards. So let's get started. Taking a look at the scenario-specific rules in the playbook, for instance, this is the page for Salamanca, or the section for Salamanca. Under sequence of play, we see that the allied player is the first player. Okay, so here's a closer look at the first third of the turn track. You can see that it's broken down by day, July 21st being the first day of the Salamanca scenario, and further down into sections of the day, which signify individual turns: morning, midday, afternoon, dusk, evening, and night. So we'll go ahead and place the turn marker on the morning of the first day. So basically, during each game turn, there are two player turns and you alternate. So in this case, the allied player would go first, then the French player, and then we move the game turn marker to the midday, and then we'd rinse and repeat. Each game turn is further broken down into these steps, the first of which is the random events phase. And that is when the active player will draw the top card from the event deck and resolve that event. Followed by movement, then enemy reaction if there's any, and then the combat phase, and if it's a night turn, we'll have night operations. Night turns are also different in that the enemy reaction and combat phases are skipped. At the end of the night turn, after the second player has completed all of their steps, the event deck is reshuffled, forming a new draw pile. I mentioned in my video on movement how night turns affect movement in and out of Ezox. In addition, during night turns, during the movement phase of the night turn, all units' movement allowances are reduced by 1. There is a speed limit rule, an exception that states that units can always move 1 hex into a non-prohibited hex, regardless of whether or not it can afford to do so. There are several things that you can only do during the night operations phase of your turn, one of which is rally. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then you'll see that you'll need to ascertain whether or not you lose, there's any morale loss due to captured terrain. Then there's the option of recovering morale points by resting. And then there's reconcealment if you're using an optional rule, which I won't be doing just yet. And then reshuffle the deck after the second player's night turn, as mentioned before. Any exceptions will be noted on the game turn track. For instance, here you'll see at the end, during the first night, there is no morale recovery. So any of your units that have been previously broken and removed from the map due to combat results or hazardous retreat failures, those units can later re-enter the game by being successfully rallied. And here is a view of the rally table. You would roll once for each unit that you are attempting to rally. Rallying is an optional action that you can take during the night turn. Rallying can also be triggered as a result of an event. If you decide to rally during your night turn, you have the option to spend a morale point to modify all of your rally rolls for that turn by a +1 die roll modifier. If you're attempting to rally an elite force, you also get a +1 die roll modifier for that as well. the modified die roll result of a 1 or a 2 results in that unit being completely eliminated from the game with no chance of being rallied in the future. 3 or 4 is a no result, and a 5 or 6 is a successful rally. You can then place any successfully rallied units on, if possible, whenever possible, on a friendly lock hex that's vacant. This is an example of a vacant French lock hex on the Salamanca map. In addition, during night turns, if you occupy 2 or more enemy lock hexes, then your opponent will lose a morale point. In addition, for each enemy objective hex that you control, that you occupy, your opponent will also lose another victory morale point for that. So let's take a look at those hexes again. Here's an example of a French objective hex. It's rimmed in this blue color. So as the allied player, if during the night turn you occupy that hex, for each such hex that you occupy during your night turn, your enemy will lose 1 morale point. In the Salamanca scenario, there is only that one French objective hex, and there are 2 allied British objective hexes. There are 2 French lock hexes, as well as 2 allied, not anti-French lock hexes. So that kind of gives you an idea. There aren't that many, but they can have a dramatic effect on your opponent's morale. The exclusive rules in the playbook, the scenario-specific rules, here's the page for the ones for Salamanca. It gives you here in the setup section the basically the reinforcement schedule, the various turns in which specific units appear on the map. These units will appear during your movement phase, anytime during your movement phase that you choose, and they will appear along the colored map edge hex sides. That would be the entry point for the allied reinforcements. And you can see here in this corner, for example, would be an entry point for the French. There are also a couple of other locations as well along the other sides of the map. Units spend movement points to enter the map, as in a normal movement action. So for this French unit to enter into this friendly lock hex, it would spend 1 movement point to do so, and then it has two movement points in this case. It could spend another one to move along this road, and then remember, roads provide bonuses, so if the entire movement is along the road, he can move all the way into this hex during his movement phase. If there's more than 1 unit scheduled to arrive on the same turn, and they arrive during the same movement phase through the same hex, then they can enter the map 1 by 1, or they must enter 1 by 1, and they can do so, and by doing so they simulate what's called a march order column of troops. In order to do so, each successive entering unit must spend 1 extra movement point than the preceding unit. So our first unit spent 1 movement point to enter here. Our next unit must spend 2, so let's say cavalry spends 2, and then out of 3 it could spend the next one here and end its movement there. Then let's say we had another unit enter, it would be cost them 1, 2, 3, so we could have this cavalry unit enter there, and therefore they form a marching column or marching line. Any hex occupied by an enemy unit will be blocked to reinforcements, this unit would not be able to enter through this friendly lock hex. In this example, it would need to enter above it or below it, or on this edge of the map in this corner. You do also have the option to delay your entry. So if this unit is scheduled to arrive on turn 1, you can push it back to turn 2 if you so choose. And then some scenarios have a more what's called a variable reinforcement schedule, where you roll to determine whether or not that unit arrives on that turn or in a later turn. During any day turn, following the first night turn, where there are units from both sides on the map, you can do what's called taking a lull turn. And essentially that means that you basically did not force march your army. You did not roll for during any reaction or combat phases, and your side has either less than 6 morale points or equal to or less than the number of morale points of your opponent. If all of those conditions apply, then you may gain a morale point at the end of your turn. Okay, so a couple of little corrections I wanted to mention, and I'm sure that this list will continue to grow, but in the Salamanca scenario, on the Salamanca map, I used this as an example of 2 adjacent towns. La Peña is not in fact a town, it is just, I guess it's considered just this lone building as a shrine in rough terrain, just outside of this town of Calvarosa de Arriba. So the zone of control would extend in and out. So that's the first one. The other one was something to do with victory conditions. I was talking about how you know, if a unit, if a player's morale drops to 0 during the course of a game, then their opponent will win. And then I mentioned that the outcome would be a draw if both of their morale points reach 0 during the same turn. That is not correct. A draw outcome, according to the basic system rules, results when at the end of the game the French player has equal to or more morale points than the Allied player. In that case, the game will end in a draw. There are no marginal victory conditions for the French player, and also make sure to look at the scenario-specific exclusive rules in the playbook to find any kind of exceptions to any of the basic rules found in the general rule book. Okay, finally I wanted to talk a little bit about these event cards. I think that each scenario comes with 12 cards that are specific to its scenario, and they're shuffled at the beginning of the game and drawn during each player's turn. Generally speaking, at the beginning of the turn, but some scenario rules will tell you that whether you draw or not, or you wait to draw until the next turn, the second game turn. Let's see. So you can see here that generally speaking, there will be 2 different events listed, and I'm sure you can probably guess that if the French player draws, then they would read the blue section of the card, and on an Allied player's turn or non-French player turn, they would read the portion in the red box. So there are also, however, yes, here we go. Here's an example of an event that would apply to either side equally. So no matter if it's the French player or the anti-French player who draws this card during the event random event phase, which is the first phase of the sequence of play, they would apply this effect immediately. And then at the end of the second player's night turn, and night turns occur about, in the Salamanca scenario, it occurs 3 times. The last one is the last game turn, so I guess it wouldn't apply. Then any discarded, drawn and discarded event cards are then shuffled back together with the draw pile to create a new draw pile. So that's about it. And I'm going to try to add rules corrections to the description section of each video as I come across them. And I also got a really great word of advice from a viewer saying that if you're very new to wargaming and you pick up this very good introduction to wargames, and you're like me, even just reading the basic rules, still maybe a little overwhelmed, you can try playing the game with just the basic system rules and wait until you're comfortable with those to apply the scenario-specific rules that are really kind of there to add chrome or more realism or historicity or whatever you want to call it. But with just the base system rules, you should be able to enjoy a nice, enriching experience, especially for first-time wargamers. So you may not necessarily need to pick up a slew of introductory war games. You may be able to just jump straight into something like Fading Glory, which has 4 different scenarios, and judging by the number of cards, not an infinite maybe, but a very, very high replayability rate, and a very high solitaire suitability because of these cards and all the die rolls and such. You may not need to this may be just the perfect first war game, Hex Encounter war game for you newcomers out there, the ones who are like me, and I know there are a few of you, so yeah, you might want to look into it. I hope you enjoyed this series. It was a lot harder than I expected it to be, so I'm not sure how many more I'll be doing in the future, but yeah, it was a great learning experience, and thanks for watching.